The Silent Bride of Kensington, a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Chapter 1. A Wedding Interrupted. It is a curious feature of memory that the mind, when confronted with horror, so often fixes upon some small and irrelevant detail. The pattern of a carpet, the angle of a shadow, the particular whiteness of a flower, and holds to it as a drowning man holds to a spar. So it was that when I came, many months later, to set down the strange business of the Ashworth wedding, the image that returned to me first was not the body at all, but the orchids, white and waxen, pinned to a dead man's breast, trembling faintly in the draught from an open vestry door. It began, as so many of our adventures began, with an urgent knock upon the door of 221B Baker Street on a raw morning in early October. I had not yet finished my breakfast when Mrs. Hudson announced, in a voice pitched somewhere between alarm and excitement, that a police inspector and a gentleman in wedding dress awaited us below. "Show them up at once," said Holmes, who had been standing at the window in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, watching the fog roll along the street with the placid interest of a naturalist observing weather. He turned to me, and I saw that spark kindle in his grey eyes, which I had come to associate with the scent of a worthy problem. "A wedding, Watson, and at this hour already gone wrong. Note the inspector's gait upon the stair. He takes the steps two at a time, yet pauses at the landing to compose himself. A death, then, and a delicate one, for he wishes to appear calm before he speaks of it." The door opened to admit Inspector Gregson, whom we had not seen since the affair of the Norwood builder, and behind him a young man of perhaps 26, his cravat still fastened for a ceremony that had evidently not been completed, his morning coat immaculate, but his face the colour of tallow. "Mr. Holmes," said Gregson, "I would not have troubled you, but Scotland Yard has never seen the like of this, and I confess myself entirely at sea. This is Mr. Reginald Voss, who was to have stood as groomsman this morning at St. Mary Abbott's in Kensington. The wedding was that of Mr. Julian Ashworth to Miss Evelyn Carow, a match much spoken of in society, I believe, sir, being your particular sphere of knowledge rather than mine." "I have heard the name Ashworth," said Holmes, motioning our visitors to chairs. "Shipping interests, is it not? And Carow, a family somewhat reduced in circumstance, if the papers are to be trusted, seeking to mend its fortunes through advantageous alliance. Pray continue, Inspector, though I think you had better let Mr. Voss tell it, since he was present, and you, I collect, were not." Voss pressed a hand to his brow before he began, and his voice, when it came, was unsteady. "Mr. Holmes, I have known Julian Ashworth since we were boys together at Harrow. This morning I called for him at his lodgings at 9:30, and we drove together to the church. He was in excellent spirits, nervous as any bridegroom is nervous, but happy, sir, happier than I had seen him in years. We arrived a little before 10, the ceremony being fixed for 11, and Julian withdrew to the vestry to wait, as is customary, while I attended to certain small errands, the ring, the licence, a word with the verger. When I returned to the vestry at 11:15 to fetch him for the ceremony, I found him." Here the young man's voice broke entirely, and it was some moments before he could continue. "I found him lying upon the floor, quite dead, and Miss Carow, who ought not to have been there at all, the bride not customarily entering the vestry before the ceremony, kneeling beside him, her wedding gown soiled with the dust of the floor, and she would not, could not, has not since spoken one single word." I confess a chill passed through me at this recital, and I glanced at Holmes to see how he received it. He had steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his eyes half closed, in the attitude I knew so well, that of a hound that has caught the first faint trace of a scent. "Not spoken since," he repeated softly. "Not screamed, not wept aloud, not called for help. Nothing, Mr. Holmes. She sits now at her father's house in Phillimore Gardens, attended by a physician, and stares before her as though she looked upon some scene invisible to the rest of us. The doctor says it is shock, that speech will return in time. But there are those—" Voss hesitated, glancing at Gregson. "There are those at the church this morning who whispered otherwise, who noted that she alone was found beside the body, who noted, Mr. Holmes, that her gloved hand lay upon his breast, precisely over the pocket where his heart had stopped. "And the cause of death?" I asked, my medical curiosity overcoming my sense of the delicacy of the moment. "That is the very devil of it, doctor," said Gregson. "There is no wound upon him, no blood, no bruise, no sign of a struggle. The police surgeon who examined him at the scene pronounced it heart failure, brought on, perhaps, by the excitement of the day. A young man, sound of constitution so far as anyone knew, dead in an instant with no mark upon him. I might have accepted it, Mr. Holmes, had it not been for one thing. And that thing?" Gregson drew from his coat a small paper packet, which he laid upon the table between us with the air of a man producing a conjurer's trick. Holmes leaned forward and, with the delicate care he brought to all such examinations, unfolded it. Within lay a single white orchid bloom, its petals already beginning to brown at the edges, and pinned through its stem, nearly invisible against the white, a slender silver pin, no longer than a matchstick, its point catching the grey morning light. "This," said Gregson, "was found upon the vestry floor beside the body, some little distance from where the boutonniere had evidently been torn from his coat. My sergeant nearly swept it away as refuse. It was only when I noticed that the pin appeared to have been recently wetted with some dark substance, now dried, that I thought it worth the keeping." Holmes said nothing for a long moment, but I saw his nostrils flare very slightly as he bent close to the flower, and when he straightened, there was in his face an expression I had learned to dread and to relish in equal measure, the look of a man who has glimpsed, in a single instant, the shape of a very dark thing. "Watson," said he, rising and reaching for his coat, "we shall want the church, the vestry, and Miss Carrow's own household before the day is out. Inspector, I must ask you to see that nothing in that vestry is touched or altered until I have examined it myself. And Mr. Voss, I must ask you a question that will seem to you unfeeling, though I assure you it is not meant so. In the whole of this morning, from the moment you left Mr. Ashworth in that vestry to the moment you found him, can you account for every soul who passed that door?" Voss looked up, and something flickered across his stricken face that I could not, in that moment, read. "No, Mr. Holmes," he said slowly, "I cannot. There were a dozen people in and about that church whom I did not see the whole time. The verger, the florist's boy, Miss Carrow's own maid, the bride's father, and, though I hesitate to name her, a lady who had no place there at all, and yet who came." "Ah," said Holmes, very quietly, and I saw that the game, as he was fond of calling it, was already afoot. Chapter 2. The Lady Who Had No Place There. We did not set out for Kensington at once. Holmes, to my surprise, bade Gregson and the wretched Voss depart ahead of us, promising to follow within the hour, and instead settled himself once more in his armchair, with the orchid and its curious pin laid upon a sheet of white paper before him. "You are wondering, Watson, why I do not fly at once to the scene," said he, without looking up. "The answer is simple. The scene will keep. A church vestry, once sealed by the police, does not run away in an hour, whereas a fact, half remembered by a frightened young man, may vanish from his mind entirely, if not seized upon, while it is fresh. I have sent Wiggins's boy after Voss with instructions that he is to be watched and, if possible, drawn into conversation regarding this mysterious lady. But that is for later. For now, tell me, Watson, what you make of this pin." I bent over the little object with the professional interest of a man who had spent some years in the Army Medical Department. "It is very fine," I said, "finer than any hat pin or brooch pin I have seen. The point is unusually sharp, sharpened, I should say, rather than merely manufactured so, and there is a residue, as the inspector said, dried along the last half-inch of the shaft. Good. And what does that residue suggest to your medical mind?" "I confess I cannot say without analysis. It might be nothing more than the flower's own sap." "It might," Holmes agreed. "And yet orchids of this variety, I believe it to be a hybrid cattleya, imported and expensive, not a bloom one buys at a street corner, do not, in my experience, exude a residue that dries to this particular blackened lustre. I shall want Stamford's chemistry rooms before the day is out. But observe this, Watson. He held the flower up to the light, turning it slowly. The stem has been cut and rewired, as is common in the florist's trade, to stiffen it for a buttonhole. But here, close by the base, the wire has been very recently unwound and rewound. See how the binding thread differs in colour from the rest, being a shade paler, as though newly applied. Someone, after this flower left the florist's hands, undid its wiring and did something to it before it reached Ashworth's coat, something that required the insertion, very precisely, of this pin. A cold feeling settled in my chest. You believe the flower itself was made into some manner of weapon? I believe it very likely, though I shall not commit myself until I have tested the residue. But consider, Watson, the beauty of such a device, if device it be. A bridegroom pins upon his own breast, with his own hand and in perfect innocence the instrument of his death, believing it nothing more than a token of the day's happiness. No one need come near him with a knife or a vial. No struggle, no cry, no wound that any surgeon, examining hastily and expecting nothing more sinister than a fainting fit, would think to search for beneath a boutonniere already crushed and disarranged in the general horror of discovery. But surely, I protested, any competent examination would find the mark of a pinprick upon the skin, would it? A pin no thicker than a needle, driven perhaps into the flesh just below the collarbone, where a boutonniere's stem is customarily threaded through the lapel and secured with precisely such a pin as this. Who would remark a single small puncture in that place, on a body already searched hastily for wounds of a more dramatic character? I think, Watson, we shall find upon Mr. Ashworth's breast a mark no larger than the prick of a rose thorn, dismissed by the police surgeon as of no consequence. He set the flower down with sudden gentleness, as though it might yet do harm. Now, before we go to Kensington, I wish to demonstrate to you something of the value of small observation, since you are forever encouraging me toward your public in this respect, and since the case now before us will demand of you a very close attention to trifles. He crossed to the window and drew back the curtain a little, indicating a figure below in the street, a coster woman with a barrow of apples, haggling with a maidservant from a house opposite. "Tell me what you make of her," said he. I studied the woman with as much care as I could bring to bear, but confessed myself able to observe nothing beyond her trade. Holmes smiled, that thin, swift smile that transformed his ascetic face. She has been a seamstress within the last 12-month, and has fallen upon hard times through the death, I should guess, of a husband employed in the building trade, and she has a daughter of perhaps 12, who is at this moment more of a worry to her than her livelihood. Holmes, this is absurd. How can you possibly— The seamstress's trade is written upon her fingers, Watson. 3 small, hardened marks upon the first and second fingers of the right hand, precisely where a needle is guided through heavy cloth, and a faint groove upon the left forefinger, where a thimble has sat for years, though she wears no thimble now. That she has fallen from that trade to costering is evident from the newness of her barrow against the shabbiness of her shawl, bought, I think, with money that ought to have gone elsewhere. Observe the barrow's fresh paint against her patched boots. A husband's death, sudden and requiring the sale of tools or stock to raise a barrow's price, is the likeliest cause. Had he left her, she would more probably have kept her needle and sought lodgers. The building trade I infer from the small quantity of white lime dust, yet visible in the seams of her better shawl, worn, I think, at some funeral gathering among men of that trade, and not fully brushed since. As for the daughter, you will observe the child's pinafore, hung to dry at the window directly above, several sizes too large for a girl who must therefore be growing quickly, at an age, therefore, where clothing and schooling become a mother's chief anxiety, and the mended tear at its hem, stitched in haste with thread that does not match, tells me the mother's mind was elsewhere when she sat to mend it, most likely upon the child herself, and some trouble concerning her. I own that I laughed aloud, despite the grim business before us, at this dazzling cascade of inference built upon threads and lime dust and the size of a child's pinafore. You will forgive me, Holmes, if I remain skeptical until you have asked the woman herself. Skepticism is the scientist's proper attitude, Watson, and I shall not ask her, for that would resolve nothing. I might be wrong in a dozen particulars and never know it, whereas the discipline of reasoning from the visible to the probable is itself the exercise I wished you to observe. It is precisely this discipline we must now bring to bear upon a vestry floor, a silent bride, and a woman who, by Mr. Voss's own uneasy account, had no business being present at a wedding not her own. Come, Watson, the hansom waits, and Kensington will not wait forever, however patient a crime scene may be. Chapter 3. St. Mary Abbots. The church of St. Mary Abbots stood grey and solemn against a sky the colour of wet slate, its tall spire lost intermittently in drifting fog. A constable at the lich-gate admitted us upon Holmes's card, and within we found the nave still strewn with the abandoned trappings of a wedding that would never now take place. White ribbon looped along the pew ends, hothouse flowers wilting in their stands, an organ silent upon its loft where, an hour before, wedding music had doubtless been rehearsed. "The guests," Holmes inquired of the constable. "Sent home, sir, all but the immediate family and Mr. Voss, on Inspector Gregson's order. There was a rare confusion, sir, I'm told. Screaming, and a lady fainted, and old Mr. Carrow near collapsed himself when he understood what had happened." Holmes nodded and led the way down the aisle toward a low door beside the chancel, which gave onto the vestry, a small, panelled chamber smelling of beeswax and old hymnals, its single window looking out upon a narrow churchyard choked with yew. Gregson awaited us there, and at his gesture we entered. The chalk outline of a body had been drawn upon the worn Turkey carpet, and a dark stain, not large, I noted with a physician's eye, far too small to indicate any wound of consequence, marked the place where, I supposed, Ashworth's head had lain. Holmes went down upon his knees at once beside this outline, heedless of his trousers, and began an examination so minute and so silent that Gregson and I exchanged a glance and said nothing, having learned long since that interruption at such moments earned only a curt rebuke. He examined the carpet fibre by fibre for some feet about the outline, then turned his attention to a small table against the far wall, upon which stood a vase of the same white orchids we had seen at Baker Street, evidently intended for the buttonholes of the groom and his party. He counted the blooms remaining. I heard him murmur 7 under his breath, and then crossed to the window, which he found unlatched, though the drop beyond into the churchyard was a good 10 feet onto flagstones. "Inspector," said he at last, rising and dusting his knees, "how many boutonnieres were cut from that vase this morning, do you know?" "I could not say, Mr. Holmes. The florist's boy delivered the vase at 8:30, I am told, and the buttonholes were pinned by, I believe by Miss Carrow's maid, whose task it was." "Then we shall want the maid. Now, observe with me, Watson, the position of that stain." He drew me down beside him and pointed with his stick. "The body lay here, upon its back, the head toward the window. Now, a man struck by sudden collapse, whether from seizure, from poison, or from any natural cause, falls where he stands, generally forward or sideways. Rarely does he fall backward and remain composed upon his back with his limbs unentangled, unless he has had a moment's warning and has, perhaps, staggered and turned before falling, or unless—" he paused. "Unless he did not fall alone," I finished, with a chill. "Unless he was assisted in his fall, or his position was arranged after death, yes. And see here." Holmes pointed to 2 faint parallel indentations in the carpet's nap, some 18 inches apart, running from near the chalk outline toward the door. "These marks are consistent with the heels of a man's shoes, dragged, very slightly, Watson, a matter of inches only, as though a body already fallen were shifted a little, turned perhaps to lie more naturally, or to remove it from beneath the window." "Then someone else was here after he fell," said Gregson slowly, "and before Miss Carrow was discovered beside him. That, Inspector, is precisely the question upon which this whole case turns. Was Miss Carrow the one who moved him? A natural enough act, if she found him collapsed and sought in her horror to make him comfortable, to loosen his collar, to cradle his head. Or did some other person enter this vestry, do what was done and depart before she came, leaving her to be discovered kneeling over a body already dead, and thereby cast beneath the shadow of suspicion that has fallen upon her since? He straightened. I should like now to examine the body itself, if the police surgeon has not yet released it, and after that, I think, we must speak with Miss Carrow, though I fear that interview will yield little in the way of words. Gregson conducted us thence to the small mortuary chamber where the remains of Julian Ashworth had been laid, still in his wedding clothes, pending the coroner's formal examination. Holmes worked with a swiftness and a delicacy that never failed to impress me, despite my own years of surgical training, and it was I who, at his direction, examined the flesh beneath the left lapel, where the boutonniere had been pinned. Here, I said, after some moments' close scrutiny with the lens Holmes provided. A single puncture, Holmes, no larger than the point of that pin we examined. Here, just below the collarbone, already discoloured at the margin, in a manner I should not expect from so trivial a wound. Discoloured how, Doctor? Gregson leaned close. A faint blackening of the tissue immediately surrounding the puncture, spreading perhaps a quarter inch, which I have seen before only in cases of... I hesitated, for the thought that had come to me was a dark one, drawn from my years in India and Afghanistan, among men who had encountered every manner of poison known to the East. In cases of what, Watson? Holmes's eyes were bright upon me. In cases of certain vegetable alkaloids employed as arrow poisons among tribal peoples, curare and its relations, which act upon the nerves controlling the heart and the muscles of respiration, producing paralysis and death within minutes. Quick heads up, guys. I've curated a collection of mind-bending, exclusive mystery stories specifically for the hardcore fans among you. These cases are so intense and wild that I literally cannot upload them here on YouTube. If you have a passion for real, unedited mind twisters, do yourself a favor. Drop down to the pinned comment or the description right now, hit that link, and check out this exclusive collection. It's going to absolutely blow your mind. Now, let's get straight back to today's case, and which, crucially, Holmes, leave behind almost no other sign. A man so poisoned would feel, I believe, a sudden numbness spreading from the site of the wound, an inability to cry out or to move, and would sink to the floor, as though struck by an apoplexy, fully conscious, perhaps, in his last moments, yet wholly unable to summon aid. The vestry fell silent, but for the distant sound of the organ loft's pigeons stirring in the rafters. Holmes had gone very still, his eyes fixed upon some point beyond the wall, and I knew that terrible, rapid engine of his mind was already at work upon the new and dreadful vista this discovery had opened. A silent death, he said at last, very low, for a silent bride. Watson, I begin to fear that Miss Carrow's affliction may be a good deal less simple than shock alone. Chapter 4. The Bride Who Would Not Speak. Phillimore Gardens was a street of tall, respectable houses, their stucco fronts grown grey with London soot, and it was to the third of these, the residence of Mr. Ambrose Carrow, that we proceeded as the church bells, mercifully silent now upon the matter of weddings, struck 1 o'clock. We were admitted by a housemaid whose eyes were red with weeping, and shown into a drawing-room heavy with the scent of laurel and camphor, where a physician of perhaps 60 years, grey-whiskered and precise in his manner, rose to greet us with evident relief. "Dr. Aldous Finch," said he, extending a hand, "physician to this family these 15 years. I confess myself glad of Mr. Holmes's presence, though I own I do not see what medicine cannot accomplish here, however much detection might wish to." "You attend Miss Carrow now?" Holmes asked. "I do. She sits above, in her own room, in the care of her aunt. I have examined her thoroughly, Mr. Holmes, and I can find no injury, no fever, no sign of any physical cause for her silence beyond what shock alone might produce. Her pulse is somewhat rapid, her pupils a trifle dilated, but these are consistent with severe nervous distress. I have prescribed rest and quiet, and I have every confidence that speech will return to her within days, once the horror of the morning has receded. Dilated pupils, Holmes repeated softly, and I saw him glance at me. Doctor, I wonder if I might trouble you for a detail of your examination. Did you observe any mark upon Miss Carrow's person? Any puncture? Any abrasion, however slight? Dr. Finch frowned. I examined her hands and wrists, as is customary in cases of shock, where a patient may have struck herself unknowingly against furniture in her distress. I found nothing beyond a small mark upon the inner surface of her left glove. She had not yet been persuaded to remove her gloves when I first attended her, but no wound beneath it that I could discover, only a faint reddening of the skin, already fading. Might I see the glove? The physician, though plainly puzzled by the request, sent for it, and presently the housemaid returned bearing a single long white kid glove, its fingers still faintly soiled with the dust of the vestry floor. Holmes examined it beneath his lens with the same minute attention he had bestowed upon the orchid, and I saw his brows draw together. Watson, come and look at this. I bent to the glove and saw, upon its inner surface, near the wrist, a tiny discoloured patch, no larger than a pinhead. The leather about it stiffened as though something had dried upon it. The same residue, I murmured. I believe so, though we shall want Stamford's chemistry to be certain. Dr. Finch, I put it to you that Miss Carrow did not merely kneel beside a stricken man in her horror. I believe she touched him, embraced him perhaps, in that first dreadful instant, and that in doing so, her gloved hand came into contact with a substance yet clinging to his breast, a substance sufficient in so small a quantity, absorbed through the thin kid of an evening glove, rather than driven into the flesh by a needle's point, to produce not death, but a lesser and more curious effect, a partial paralysis of the muscles governing speech, perhaps of the throat and tongue alone, while leaving the mind entirely clear and the limbs, in time, unimpaired. Dr. Finch stared at him. You are suggesting, sir, that Miss Carrow's silence is not shock at all, but poisoning. I am suggesting it as a hypothesis to be tested, not yet asserted as fact. But if I am right, doctor, then your rest and quiet, however excellent as general treatment, may be doing your patient a disservice, for a woman who cannot speak because her body will not permit it is a very different case from one who cannot speak because her mind recoils from doing so, and the two demand very different care and very different urgency, for the fading of a bruise, as you yourself have described upon that glove, tells us the substance's effect is already lessening. Miss Carrow may, within days, recover speech entirely on her own, whatever we do. Then why do you press the matter now, if nature will resolve it? Holmes's face darkened. Because, doctor, whoever did this to Julian Ashworth does not yet know that Miss Carrow will recover her voice, and may act to ensure she never does, if they come to believe she saw or knows something that could name them. I should like, with your permission and hers, to see her now, and I should like a nurse or a constable posted outside her door before nightfall, ostensibly for her comfort, in truth for her protection. It was arranged, not without some argument from the aunt, a formidable widow named Mrs. Prynne, who guarded her niece's door like a dragon, and yielded only when Gregson's authority was invoked. We found Evelyn Carrow seated in a low chair beside her window, still in the ruins of her wedding gown, for she would permit no one to change her from it, her hands folded with unnatural stillness in her lap, her eyes, wide, dark, and dry of tears, fixed upon some point in the middle distance that none of us could follow. She did not turn her head as we entered. Holmes approached slowly and seated himself upon a low stool some little distance from her, so that he might meet her gaze without looming over her, and spoke in a voice I had rarely heard him use, gentle, unhurried, without a trace of the incisive edge that so often marked his questioning. Miss Carrow, my name is Sherlock Holmes. I have come to find out who did this to Mr. Ashworth, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove it, that your silence this morning is no fault of your mind, but of your body only, and that it will pass. I do not ask you to speak, for I think you cannot. But I ask you if you are able to look at me when I say a thing that is true, and to look away when I say a thing that is false. Will you try?" For a long moment there was no response at all, and I feared the attempt had failed entirely. Then, slowly, as though the movement cost her some great effort of will, Evelyn Carrow's eyes moved from their fixed middle distance and settled upon Holmes's face. "Good," said he softly. "You went into that vestry before the ceremony, though it is not the custom for a bride to do so." Her eyes remained upon him. "You went because you had received some word, some message, that troubled you, and you wished to speak with Julian alone before you were wed to him." Still her gaze held steady, unwavering, upon Holmes's face, and I felt the hair rise upon my arms, for here, in this silent and terrible confirmation, lay the first thread of the truth we had come to find. Chapter 5. A Message Unread. Holmes did not press further upon the sick room, judging, rightly I thought, that Evelyn Carrow's strength, whatever its source, was not infinite, and that too eager a pursuit of her silent testimony might close the small door she had, with such evident effort, opened to us. "One more question only, Miss Carrow," said he, "and then we shall leave you to your rest. The message that summoned you to the vestry, was it written, or was it spoken to you by some person?" Her eyes moved, very deliberately, to a small escritoire that stood against the far wall of her chamber, and Holmes, following that gaze, rose at once and crossed to it. Upon its surface lay a scattering of the morning's correspondence, wedding congratulations, no doubt, sent by friends who did not yet know the day had ended in tragedy. But Holmes's quick eye passed over these and fastened upon a small crumpled ball of paper that had been thrust, as though in haste or distress, into the wastepaper basket beside the desk. He drew it out and smoothed it upon the desk's surface. I crowded close to read it, and Gregson, entering behind us, did likewise. It was a single line, written in a hand unfamiliar to me, in ink that had smudged slightly as though written in haste. "Come to the vestry before 11, and come alone. There is a matter concerning Julian's honour that you must know before you bind yourself to him. A friend." "An anonymous warning," Gregson breathed. "Then someone lured her there deliberately." "Or," said Holmes, "someone wished it to appear that she had been lured there, which is not quite the same thing. Miss Carrow," he turned again to the silent figure by the window, "did you see who delivered this note?" Her eyes moved to him, then away, the signal, by their earlier arrangement, for a negative, and then, after a moment's evident struggle, she reached with visible effort toward the small table beside her chair, and with a hand that trembled from the exertion, drew from beneath a folded handkerchief a small object which she held out toward Holmes. It was a single white glove button, of a kind used upon a lady's evening glove, but far too small and too delicately worked for a man's garment, and of a design, 3 seed pearls set in a silver rosette, that I judged, even in my ignorance of such matters, to be costly and distinctive. "You found this," said Holmes slowly, "in the vestry, near where the note-bearer might have stood, or near where Julian fell?" Her eyes held his, the affirmative. "This belongs to a lady, then, and not to the maid who delivered your buttonholes, whose station would not run to silver and pearl. Miss Carrow, is this button the property of a woman known to you, a woman who had, perhaps, some claim upon Mr. Ashworth's affections before he came to know you?" For the first time since we had entered the room, something that was not merely stillness crossed the bride's pale face. A flicker, swift and terrible, that I can describe only as recognition mingled with fear, and her eyes held Holmes's own without wavering. "Charlotte Rain," murmured Dr. Finch from the doorway, where he had followed us, and at the name Evelyn Carrow's whole frame seemed to contract, as though the very sound of it struck her like a blow. "You know the lady, Doctor?" Holmes asked sharply. "I have attended her family for years, Mr. Holmes, as I have the Carrows. Miss Rain was, some 18 months since, all but engaged to Julian Ashworth. A match broken off, I understood, at his instigation, though the circumstances were never made public, and the lady's pride, I am told, has never fully recovered from the slight. She was not upon the guest list this morning, to my certain knowledge, for I had it from Mrs. Prynne herself that her name had been struck from the invitations at Mr. Ashworth's particular request. And yet Mr. Voss informed us, said Holmes, that a lady who had no place there did in fact appear at the church this morning. He closed his hand about the little button, and I saw in his eyes that particular hard brightness that told me a suspect, at last, had risen clear above the fog of the case, though I had learned, in years of such investigations at his side, that the suspect who rises first is rarely the one who falls last. I think, Watson, we have delayed with Miss Carrow long enough for one day. She has given us more than I dared hope, and at a cost to herself that I do not underestimate. Miss Carrow. He bowed to her with a gravity I had rarely seen him extend to anyone. You have done your betrothed a greater service this hour, in silence, than many a witness manages with a full command of speech. I shall not trouble you again until I have something more than questions to bring you. We took our leave of the sick-room, and I confess my own heart was heavy as we descended the stair, for there was something in the silent bride's stricken eyes that stayed with me long after, the eyes, I thought, of a woman who knew a great deal more than 3 seed pearls and a stranger's note, and who suffered now not only the effects of poison, but the far crueler torment of being unable to speak the name that burned behind her silence. You believe she suspects the truth already? I said to Holmes once we were again in the street. I believe, said he, drawing his coat about him against the chill, that Evelyn Carrow saw something in that vestry that she has not yet found a way to tell us, whether from the paralysis of her throat or the paralysis of some deeper fear, and that the button she gave us, true though it may be as a fact, may yet prove to be exactly what someone wished us to find, a signpost pointing very conveniently toward Miss Charlotte Rain, when the truth, Watson, in my long experience of such matters, is very rarely so obliging as to leave its calling card upon the floor beside the corpse. Chapter 6. The Jilted Miss Rain. Charlotte Rain received us that evening in the drawing-room of her mother's house in Cadogan Square, a chamber furnished with a taste so studied, so precisely arranged in every particular, that I could not but feel it a kind of armour against a world that had, by Dr. Finch's account, dealt her a public humiliation not 2 years past. She was a striking woman, dark of hair and pale of complexion, with a directness of gaze that few young ladies of my acquaintance would have thought proper, and she did not trouble to conceal her surprise, nor entirely her displeasure, at our visit. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, when the maid had announced us, "I confess I expected the police before I expected you, though I suppose you amount to much the same thing in the end. You have come, I collect, about poor Julian. You had heard, then, before we arrived. All London will have heard by now, Mr. Holmes. Do sit down, both of you, though I warn you I have little patience for the pretence of ignorance that I understand often precedes an accusation." She seated herself with a composure that seemed to cost her something, and folded her hands. "You wish to know whether I was at the church this morning? I was. You wish to know why, when I was not invited, and had, indeed, been expressly excluded by Julian's own hand. I will tell you, and save us both the tedium of your working toward it by inference. I went because I could not stay away. I am not proud of it, but I will not lie to spare myself your suspicion, for lies are more easily unravelled than the truth, and I have no wish to hang for a murder I did not commit, merely because I was foolish enough to watch, from the gallery, the wedding of a man I once loved." "You watched from the gallery," Holmes said, "not from the vestry. I have never in my life set foot in that vestry, Mr. Holmes, either this morning or at any other time. And yet a button was found there this morning, silver, set with 3 seed pearls, of a kind, I am told, worn upon a lady's evening glove." For the first time, something like genuine alarm crossed Miss Rain's composed features, and her hand moved, almost involuntarily, to the cuff of her own gown, where I now observed a small glove, pale grey rather than white, resting upon a side table. "I own a pair of gloves so trimmed," she said slowly, "a gift from my late father, worn perhaps twice a year upon occasions of consequence. But Mr. Holmes, I did not wear them this morning. I wore these grey ones you see there, being unwilling to dress as though I attended the wedding as an honoured guest, when I came, in truth, as nothing more than an uninvited ghost at another woman's happiness." She rose abruptly and crossed to a small cabinet, from which she produced, after a moment's search, a glove-box lined in blue velvet. Within lay a single glove of white kid, its wrist trimmed with silver and pearl, but where its fellow should have rested beside it, there was only an empty impression in the velvet. "The other is missing," she said, and her voice for the first time trembled. "I had not looked in this box in some weeks, Mr. Holmes. I swear it to you. Anyone with access to this house, a servant, a caller, my own mother's friends who come and go with a freedom I have never questioned, might have taken it. Or someone who wished a certain lady to be suspected of a murder she did not commit," said Holmes quietly, "might have taken a single glove some time ago, against just such a need as arose this morning, and left its fellow in this box to be discovered exactly as we have discovered it. A discovery, Miss Rain, that I confess strikes me as a shade too convenient in its timing, arriving as it does within hours of my asking the very question that produces it." Miss Rain stared at him. "You believe I have been made a scapegoat. I believe it is a strong possibility that must be weighed, though I do not discount the alternative that you protest too readily and too well. Tell me, did you speak with Julian Ashworth at any time in recent weeks? A letter, perhaps, or a chance meeting?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I read a great deal. "There was a letter," she admitted at last, "some 10 days since. Julian wrote to me. A strange letter, Mr. Holmes, not of love, nor of apology for the manner of our parting, but of business. He asked whether I had retained certain papers from the time of our engagement, correspondence he called them, though he did not specify their nature, and offered a sum of money for their return, a sum so considerable that I own I was more insulted than tempted by it. I wrote back that I possessed no such papers and wanted none of his money, and I heard nothing further from him until this morning, when I could not, God forgive my weakness, keep myself from the gallery of that church. May I see this letter? I burned it, Mr. Holmes, in a temper, the same evening I received it. I wish now, for my own sake, that I had not." Holmes rose, and I saw upon his face the particular stillness that meant a new fact had lodged itself among the others, already gathering in that extraordinary mind, finding, perhaps, some connection not yet visible to my own slower reasoning. "One further question, Miss Rain, and then we shall trouble you no more tonight. Do you know of any person, man or woman, who had dealings with Julian Ashworth's business or estate, who might have had reason to fear the recovery of old correspondence, or who might indeed have known of your broken engagement well enough to lay a false trail toward your door should the need arise?" Charlotte Rain was silent a long moment, twisting the empty glove-box in her hands. "There is his solicitor," she said at last, slowly, as though the thought surprised even herself in the speaking of it. "Mr. Percival Sedgwick. He has managed the Ashworth estate since Julian's father died, and he was, I recall it now, though I attached no significance to it at the time, a frequent visitor to this house during the months of my engagement, ostensibly upon matters of settlement, though his visits continued a little longer, I always thought, than strict business required." Holmes said nothing, but as we descended once more into the fog-bound street, I saw that he walked with the quick, light step of a man who has found, at last, the thread by which an entire tapestry may be unpicked. Chapter 7. A Web of Debts. Holmes did not go directly to Mr. Sedgwick, though I confess I expected it. A solicitor who fears the exposure of old letters does not receive unannounced callers gracefully, Watson, he observed, as our cab rattled through streets now nearly empty of traffic, and I would sooner know the ground I walk upon before I walk upon it. We shall call instead upon Mr. Ambrose Carow, the bride's own father, whom we have not yet troubled with our questions, and who, I think, may hold pieces of this puzzle that neither Voss nor Rain nor the silent Miss Carow herself can supply. We found the elder Carow in his study, a small, cluttered chamber lined with ledgers rather than books, and it took no great effort of deduction, even I could see it, to perceive in the shabbiness of the carpet, the frayed cuffs of the old man's coat, and the anxious way his eyes travelled again and again to a locked drawer of his desk, that here was a household maintaining appearances upon rapidly diminishing means. "Mr. Holmes," said Caro, rising unsteadily, "I had hoped, that is, I had prayed, that this business might be resolved without further disturbance to my daughter. She has suffered enough, sir, God knows, without the police and the newspapers. I have no wish to increase her suffering, Mr. Caro, and considerably more wish to end the circumstance that caused it. May I speak plainly? I am given to understand that this marriage, so tragically ended, was arranged in some part for reasons of family finance." The old man's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might weep outright. "You have heard, then?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I will not insult you by denying it. My affairs have been in a sad state these 5 years past. Investments that failed, a partner who absconded with funds I could ill spare, and when Julian Ashworth's attentions turned toward my daughter, I own that I encouraged the match with more enthusiasm than perhaps a father ought, seeing in it a rescue for us both. For Evelyn's dowry, such as it was, would scarce have secured her a comfortable establishment without some corresponding fortune upon the other side. And Julian Ashworth's fortune, do you know it to have been as considerable as report suggested? I believed it so, Mr. Holmes, upon the word of his solicitor, Mr. Sedgwick, who conducted all the settlement negotiations upon Julian's behalf, Julian himself having little head for business and less patience for it. Sedgwick assured me that the estate, though encumbered by certain shipping losses in recent years, remained substantial, and that the marriage settlement would provide amply for Evelyn's security, and, I confess it shames me to admit, for the discreet settlement of certain debts of my own, which Sedgwick had somehow come to know of, and which he proposed, with what seemed at the time great generosity, to see quietly discharged from the estate once the marriage was solemnized. Holmes leaned forward, and I saw the light kindle sharp in his eyes. "Sedgwick proposed to pay your debts, Mr. Caro, out of Julian's own fortune, before Julian himself had any knowledge of the arrangement, or any say in it. He said it was a common enough courtesy between families of standing to smooth the path of a match advantageous to both. I did not think to question a solicitor of such evident respectability. Should I have done, Mr. Holmes?" The old man's voice cracked upon the question, and I saw in his face the dawning of a fear far worse than any he had yet expressed. "I think," said Holmes slowly, "that you should have asked yourself why a solicitor entrusted with safeguarding his client's estate should be so eager to see a portion of it diverted to the debts of the client's prospective father-in-law, arranged, moreover, in a manner that Julian himself appears not to have sanctioned. Tell me, Mr. Caro, was this arrangement set down in writing, witnessed, sanctioned by Julian's own signature?" "There were papers," Caro admitted. "Sedgwick brought them to me himself, already bearing Julian's signature, some weeks before the wedding. I did not think to question it. Why should I? Julian was fond of Evelyn, eager for the match, and it seemed only natural that he should wish to ease the path of his bride's family. Might I see these papers?" Caro rose and, with trembling hands, unlocked the drawer at which his eyes had strayed so anxiously since our arrival, and produced a slim sheaf of documents, which Holmes seized upon with an eagerness he did not trouble to disguise. He examined the signature upon the first page for a long moment beneath his lens, then turned to the second page, and the third, his brow drawing ever tighter as he proceeded. "Watson," he said at last, very quietly, "come and look at this signature, and then look at this one." He indicated 2 instances of Julian Ashworth's name, one upon the settlement document, the other upon a letter of thanks that Caro, at Holmes's request, had also produced from among his correspondence, a letter written, beyond doubt, in Julian's own hand. I compared them as closely as my untrained eye permitted, and even to me the difference, once pointed out, was unmistakable. The genuine signature flowed with a certain careless energy. The capital A of Ashworth swept high and generous. The signature upon the settlement was smaller, more careful. The same letter formed with a hesitation that spoke, I thought, of an unfamiliar hand laboring to copy a familiar one. A forgery, I breathed. A very competent forgery, Watson. Competent enough to deceive a father anxious for his daughter's security and disinclined, in his relief, to examine too closely the signature of a young man he had every reason to trust. Mr. Carrow, Holmes turned to the old man, whose face had gone the colour of ash. I believe your daughter's marriage settlement was never sanctioned by Julian Ashworth at all, but was drawn up and signed in his name by another hand entirely, for purposes that had nothing whatever to do with your comfort or your daughter's happiness, and everything to do with concealing something Mr. Percival Sedgwick very urgently did not wish examined. Chapter 5. Too Perfect a Case. It was near midnight when we returned at last to Baker Street, and I confess my mind reeled with the day's revelations, the poisoned orchid, the silent bride, the jilted Miss Rain and her conveniently missing glove, the forged settlement, and now the shadowy figure of Mr. Percival Sedgwick, solicitor, standing at the centre of it all like a spider at the heart of a web he had spun with such patience that none had thought to look for it. "It fits together too neatly, does it not, Watson?" said Holmes, settling into his chair and reaching for his pipe. "A jilted woman with motive, and now apparent opportunity, established by a glove, conveniently missing from its box. It is precisely the case Scotland Yard would wish for, simple, sordid, requiring no great effort of imagination, and I distrust it for that very reason." "You believe Sedgwick planted the glove?" "I believe it a strong possibility, though I cannot yet prove it. Consider the sequence, Watson. Sedgwick, we may reasonably suppose, has for some time been embezzling from the Ashworth estate. The forged settlement suggests a man well practised in the art of imitating his client's signature, and a solicitor does not develop such a skill for one document alone. Julian, perhaps growing suspicious, recall his strange letter to Miss Rain, inquiring after old correspondence, papers that might, I now suspect, have contained some earlier hint of irregularity in Sedgwick's dealings, that Julian half remembered and wished to verify. Julian, I say, may have begun to make inquiries that threatened to expose the fraud before it could be concealed. A wedding, Watson, is precisely the occasion upon which a young man's financial affairs come under the closest scrutiny. Settlements drawn, accounts examined, trustees appointed. Sedgwick had, I think, a matter of days, perhaps hours, in which to act before his defalcations came to light. So he killed Julian to prevent the discovery. So I believe, though we must yet prove both the method and the motive beyond the reach of reasonable doubt, and having killed him, by means so subtle that a coroner's surgeon might easily have returned a verdict of natural causes, he required only that no closer examination be made. And what better way to ensure the case remained unexamined than to provide the police with a suspect so convenient, so laden with apparent motive, that no one would think to look further? A jilted former fiancée present at the church against all propriety, her glove found beside the body. Gregson himself, Watson, for all his solid qualities, would have closed this case within the week upon such evidence, had we not been called in. But the button, Holmes, if Sedgwick planted it, when did he obtain it? Miss Rain herself said the glove had been missing some weeks, its fellow left behind in the box. Precisely the detail that most excites my interest. If the glove was taken weeks before this morning, then the plan to implicate Miss Rain was not conceived in the desperate haste of this morning's crime, but laid down long in advance, which tells us, Watson, that Sedgwick did not act upon sudden impulse when he learned of Julian's inquiries, but had already, for reasons we do not yet know, prepared a scapegoat against the day his fraud might come under threat. This was no crime of a single desperate morning. It was the culmination of a scheme long in the building. He drew hard upon his pipe, and the smoke wreathed blue about his sharp profile in the lamplight. There is one thing more that troubles me, and troubles me a good deal. If Sedgwick required a private moment with Julian in that vestry, to substitute the poisoned orchid for one of the 7 remaining in the vase, or to tamper with the buttonhole already pinned to his coat, how did he contrive to be alone with him, unremarked, in a church crowded with wedding guests and attendants, at the very hour when every eye in Kensington might be supposed fixed upon the bridegroom? Perhaps he was among the guests and slipped away unnoticed. Perhaps, or perhaps, Watson, he had some more particular reason to be admitted to that vestry that would arouse no suspicion whatever, the reason, indeed, that any solicitor managing a young man's estate might have, upon the very morning that young man was to be married and his affairs settled upon a new footing. Holmes's eyes glittered in the firelight. I think, tomorrow, we must learn a great deal more of Mr. Percival Sedgwick, his habits, his associates, his standing among his fellow solicitors, and above all, whether he was seen this morning at St. Mary Abbot's by anyone at all, guest or servant, who might place him within reach of that vestry door. He fell silent then, and I, exhausted by the day's revelations, soon sought my bed, leaving Holmes as I so often left him, seated before the dying fire, his pipe glowing faintly in the darkness, his mind, I did not doubt, already ranging far ahead of my own slower comprehension, toward some conclusion he had not yet chosen to share. I woke near dawn to find him gone from his chair, and a note upon the mantel in his swift, angular hand. Gone to Doctors' Commons and the Law List. Back by 10. Do not, on any account, call upon Sedgwick without me. S.H. I own the instruction gave me pause, for it was not like Holmes to anticipate so precisely that I might be tempted to act alone, unless, I thought uneasily, he had reason to believe that Sedgwick, aware by now that Scotland Yard's interest in the case had not slackened as he might have hoped, had already begun to take some measure of his own against the threat that Evelyn Carrow's returning voice, however slowly it returned, must surely represent. Chapter 9. The Hidden Inconsistency. Holmes returned, as promised, a little before 10, shaking rain from his coat and wearing the particular expression of suppressed satisfaction that told me his morning's researches had not been wasted. Percival Sedgwick, said he, without preamble, seating himself and drawing his notebook from his pocket, is a solicitor of 51 years, senior partner in the firm of Sedgwick and Hale, of Lincoln's Inn Fields, who has managed the Ashworth family's affairs since the death of Julian's father, some 11 years since. He is a widower, without children, of outwardly unimpeachable reputation, a churchwarden, Watson, if you can credit it, and a subscriber to no fewer than 3 charitable societies. And yet, he paused, and I saw the familiar gleam, and yet the law list shows that Sedgwick and Hale suffered a considerable reduction in their client roster some 3 years past, following the collapse of a speculative investment scheme in South American railway bonds, in which it is quietly rumoured, though never proven, that the firm's own funds, and perhaps funds entrusted to it by clients, were rather more deeply committed than prudence would suggest. I spoke this morning, under a name not my own, with a clerk of my acquaintance at Lincoln's Inn, who confirmed that Sedgwick's private fortune has been the subject of some whispered concern among his fellow practitioners these 2 years, and that the Ashworth estate, being among the largest and least closely supervised remaining in his charge, since Julian himself, by every account, took scarcely any interest in the details of his own finances, would represent, to a man in difficulties, a resource of very great and very tempting proportions. Then the motive stands clear. The motive, yes, the method and the opportunity remain to be proven, and it is upon those that a conviction must ultimately rest. For motive alone hangs no man in an English court, however strongly it may satisfy our own private conviction. He rose and crossed to the mantel, where he had, I now saw, laid out once more the poisoned orchid and its pin, alongside the glove button and a photograph of the settlement's forged signature, which Gregson had permitted him to have copied. I received also this morning a message from young Stamford, whose chemistry rooms I imposed upon yesterday evening with the residue from both pin and glove. The substance is, as your own medical instinct suggested, Watson, an alkaloid of the curare family, though refined and concentrated to a degree seldom encountered outside a laboratory or the collection of a serious student of toxicology, not, in short, the crude preparation a tribal hunter might apply to an arrow, but something a man of scientific education, with access to a well-stocked cabinet of specimens, might himself have refined for a purpose very far removed from any arrow's flight. A man of scientific education, I repeated slowly. Sedgwick is a solicitor, Holmes, not a chemist. No, Holmes agreed, which is precisely the inconsistency that has troubled me since yesterday evening, and which I confess I have not yet resolved to my full satisfaction. A solicitor of 51, however desperate his finances, does not commonly possess the knowledge to refine a South American arrow poison to the pitch of purity Stamford's analysis reveals, nor easy access to the raw material in the first instance. Someone supplied this substance to our murderer, Watson, or instructed him in its preparation, or, and this is the possibility that most exercises my mind at present, someone else entirely performed that portion of the crime that required scientific skill, while Sedgwick, whose skill lay rather in forgery and the manipulation of documents, performed the portion that required only opportunity and a familiar face admitted without question into a bridegroom's private moments. An accomplice? Perhaps. Or perhaps I do Sedgwick an injustice, and he possesses knowledge I have not yet discovered. A period of study abroad in his youth, a collection of specimens inherited from some relative in the medical or missionary trade, 100 innocent explanations that a man of 51 years might offer for an unexpected fluency in toxicology. I do not say the theory is disproved, Watson, only that it is not yet proved, and I have made it a rule these many years never to close my mind to an alternative until the evidence itself closes it for me. He tapped the photograph of the forged signature thoughtfully. There is one thing more I have kept from you and from Gregson both, and I do so now because I think the time has come to share it, though I confess I have turned it over in my mind since yesterday morning without yet finding its proper place in the pattern. He drew from his pocket a small folded slip of paper, which he had, I now realized, extracted from somewhere during our examination of the vestry the previous day, and had said nothing of it since. "I found this," said he, "caught beneath the leg of the vestry table, where it had fallen, I think, and been trodden nearly out of sight in the confusion following the discovery of the body. It is a torn corner of a larger sheet," observed the ragged edge, bearing a fragment of handwriting that I believe, upon comparison with the settlement documents, to be in the same hand that forged Julian Ashworth's signature. He held it to the light, and I saw, in a small and careful script, the fragment of a single line, "The second payment by Michaelmas, or I cannot answer for what he may." "A threat," I said slowly. "Someone was threatening Sedgwick, or Sedgwick threatening someone else." "That, Watson, is precisely the question I have not yet answered, and I begin to suspect that until I do, we shall continue to see this case as a simple thing of one guilty man and one convenient scapegoat, when the truth may prove a good deal more tangled than either Scotland Yard or, I confess, my own first instincts have supposed. Chapter 10. The Second Death. We had scarcely finished our breakfast the following morning when Gregson arrived at Baker Street in a state of considerable agitation, his usually composed features drawn with the particular pallor of a man who has looked upon violent death too many times to be indifferent to it, and yet never quite grows accustomed to its arrival. "Mr. Holmes, there has been another. The verger's assistant at St. Mary Abbott's, young Thomas Price, no more than 19 years of age, was found this morning in the churchyard, beneath the vestry window, his neck broken. It has all the appearance of a fall, sir, and yet you do not believe it a fall," Holmes finished, already reaching for his coat. "I do not know what I believe, Mr. Holmes, save that a second death within 3 days of the first, at the very same church, strains my credulity a good deal further than I care to admit." We reached St. Mary Abbott's within the half-hour, to find the churchyard already cordoned by constables, and the body of the unfortunate young man laid beneath a tarpaulin near the base of the very wall below the vestry's unlatched window. Holmes knelt beside him with his lens, examining the position of the limbs, the angle of the fall, the state of the ground beneath. "He did not fall from that window by accident," said Holmes at length, rising. "Observe, Gregson, the bruising upon the forearms, here and here, consistent with a man who has gripped something, or been gripped, before his fall, and not with the loose, unresisting posture of a body that has simply toppled, And here, upon the flagstones some 6 feet from where he lies, a scuff mark in the moss that suggests a struggle, brief but real, took place at the window's edge before he went over. Then he was pushed. I believe so. But observe further. The window from which he fell is the very window of the vestry in which Julian Ashworth died. The same window I noted, upon our first examination, to be unlatched, though offering a considerable drop onto these very flagstones. I believe, Gregson, that young Price saw something on the morning of the wedding, some detail of the murderer's presence in that vestry, which he did not, at the time, understand the significance of, but which, upon reflection, or perhaps upon some idle remark made to a friend or fellow servant that reached the wrong ears, came to represent a danger to the person he had unknowingly observed. You believe he was silenced? I believe it very probable, and I reproach myself, Gregson, that I did not think to question every servant and attendant of that church more closely upon our first visit, for I confess the whole of my attention was given over to the principal actors of this tragedy, and I neglected the humbler witnesses who so often see the most precisely, because no one troubles to notice them at their work. Holmes's face was grim, as I had rarely seen it. We must learn at once whom young Price spoke with in the days since the murder, and whether he had, in recent hours, sought out any person with information he believed valuable. It fell to Gregson's sergeants to canvass the church's staff, and within an hour we had our answer from a scullery girl, tearful and frightened, who admitted that Thomas Price had confided to her, only the previous evening, that he intended to call upon a gentleman of business the following morning, having remembered something of the wedding day that he believed might be worth a guinea or two to the right ears. A foolish and fatal ambition. I thought with a pang of pity, in a boy who had understood neither the danger of what he knew nor the character of the man from whom he hoped to extract payment for his silence. Blackmail, said Holmes heavily, as we walked away from the churchyard some time later. Or an attempt at it, at least, however innocently conceived. The boy saw something. I would wager my reputation it concerned the vestry window itself, perhaps a figure entering or leaving by it rather than by the door, which would explain both his own peculiar knowledge and the murderer's presence at a means of access no ordinary guest would think to use. And in his youthful folly, he sought to profit from his silence, rather than bringing it at once to the police. It cost him his life, Watson, and it very nearly closes off the one avenue of independent testimony that might have corroborated whatever Miss Carrow herself eventually finds the strength to tell us. Do you believe Sedgwick capable of such violence with his own hands, Holmes? A solicitor of 51, overpowering a boy of 19 at a window's edge. Holmes was silent a long moment, his eyes distant. That, Watson, said he at last, is the very question that has begun to reshape my entire understanding of this case. I do not think Percival Sedgwick pushed that boy from the window with his own hands, any more than I now believe he refined, alone in some hidden laboratory, the alkaloid that killed Julian Ashworth. I believe, Watson, that we have been hunting a single fox, when in truth we track the movements of two, a fox who forges documents and diverts fortunes with a pen, and a second, altogether more dangerous creature, who supplies the poison, and does, when it is required, whatever violence the first cannot bring himself to commit directly. And until we learn the name and nature of that second creature, I do not think Evelyn Carrow, whose voice may yet return to name what she saw, is safe in her own bed a single night longer than we can help. Chapter 11. Watson's Notebook. That evening, at Holmes's request, I set myself to the task of compiling, in the pages of my own notebook, every fact and inference the case had thus far yielded, in the hope that some pattern invisible to us amid the day's rush of discovery might emerge from the calm ordering of the whole. Holmes sat opposite, his eyes closed, his fingers steepled, listening as I read each item aloud, interjecting now and again with a correction or a question. Item the first, I began. Julian Ashworth was killed by a refined curare alkaloid, introduced through a poisoned pin concealed within his own wedding boutonniere, in a manner requiring both scientific knowledge of toxicology and precise physical access to the flowers before they reached his coat. Add, said Holmes without opening his eyes, that the flowers were delivered at 8:30 and pinned by Miss Carrow's maid, whose movements between that hour and the ceremony we have not yet traced with sufficient care. I made the note. Item the second. Percival Sedgwick, solicitor to the Ashworth estate, stood to lose a great deal should his management of Julian's fortune come under close examination, as any marriage settlement must inevitably invite, and the settlement documents themselves bear a forged signature that Sedgwick, by training and opportunity, was well placed to produce. Add that Sedgwick's own finances suffered severely 3 years past, giving him both motive and, we may reasonably suppose, considerable practice in concealment before this final and most desperate concealment of all. Item the third. A glove belonging to Charlotte Raine was found at the scene, though the lady herself denies having worn it that day, and its fellow was discovered missing from her own possession for some weeks prior, suggesting the glove was taken in advance and planted to cast suspicion upon her. A theory, Watson, not yet a certainty, though I incline toward it strongly. Item the fourth. Evelyn Carrow was summoned to the vestry by an anonymous note, and appears, by her own silent testimony, to have witnessed something there that she has not yet found means to communicate, beyond the identification, tentative, and perhaps itself a false trail, of Miss Raine's button. Add, said Holmes, and here his eyes opened, sharp and thoughtful, that Miss Carrow's own affliction, the temporary paralysis of speech, argues that she came into direct contact with the poison herself, most probably through an embrace given to Julian after his collapse, but before his death was fully accomplished, for the alkaloid, being slow enough in its final effect to permit some moments of consciousness, as your own testimony suggests, Watson, may have allowed him some brief interval in which his bride found him, touched him, perhaps even heard some fragment of speech from his own lips, before the paralysis claimed him entirely. I stopped my pen upon the page. You believe Julian spoke to her, Holmes, that she may have heard something, a name even, before he died? I believe it possible, and if it is so, Watson, it explains a great deal that has puzzled me. Not merely her silence, which the poison itself sufficiently accounts for, but the particular quality of dread I observed in her eyes when we spoke of it. A dread that seemed to me the dread not of a witness to violence in the abstract, but of a woman who holds within her some specific, dreadful knowledge she is desperate and unable to share. Continue, Watson. Item the fifth. Thomas Price, the verger's assistant, was murdered, thrown from the vestry window, having apparently witnessed some detail of the crime that he foolishly sought to turn to his own profit. Add that his death establishes, beyond reasonable doubt, that our murderer or murderers remain active in this matter and are prepared to kill again to preserve their secret, a fact that bears most gravely upon the safety of Miss Carrow herself, whose returning voice, however gradual, must represent to them a danger fully as great as young Price's loose tongue proved to be. Item the sixth, and last as yet recorded, a torn fragment of paper, found beneath the vestry table, bearing what appears to be a threat concerning a second payment due by Michaelmas, in a hand matching the forged signature upon the settlement, suggesting some person held leverage over Sedgwick, or Sedgwick over some other party, the nature of which we have not yet determined. Holmes rose and began to pace the length of our sitting-room, as was ever his habit when the fullness of a problem pressed most closely upon his mind. There is a shape here, Watson, that I can almost see entire, and yet one piece continues to elude me, the piece that would explain how a solicitor of 51 years, whatever his desperation, came to possess a refined and purified arrow poison of a kind that, Stamford assures me, is known to perhaps a dozen serious toxicologists in the whole of England. I do not think Sedgwick prepared that poison himself. I think he obtained it, purchased it perhaps, or was supplied with it by an associate whose skill lay precisely where his own did not, an associate to whom that torn fragment of threatening correspondence may well refer. He stopped abruptly before the fire, and I saw, in the sudden set of his jaw, that some new thought had struck him with particular force. Watson, Dr. Aldous Finch, The family physician. Holmes, surely. Consider it, Watson, before you dismiss it. Here is a man with 15 years' intimate acquaintance with both the Carrow and Rain families. A man of unquestionable medical and, we may fairly presume, considerable toxicological knowledge. A man who examined Miss Carrow first upon the morning of the murder, and who therefore had every opportunity to note, and perhaps to shape in his reporting to us, the very glove and the very symptom that first set us upon the trail of poison rather than shock. A man, moreover, who stood in the room with us when we first learned of Charlotte Rain's missing glove, and who supplied, unprompted, her very name. I confess a chill passed through me at this recital, for I had thought Dr. Finch, throughout our dealings, a figure of unimpeachable and rather comforting respectability. Precisely, I now realized with some discomfort, the sort of figure whose word we had taken almost without question at every turn. You believe Finch and Sedgwick are confederates. I believe it a possibility that can no longer be ignored, though I do not yet assert it as fact. Tomorrow, Watson, I think we must look a good deal more closely into the affairs, the associations, and above all the financial circumstances of the good doctor, and I think, moreover, that the time has very nearly come when I must set a trap of my own devising, for I do not believe we shall unmask this conspiracy, whatever its final shape, by questions alone. Chapter 12. The Doctor's Debts. Holmes spent the better part of the following morning about inquiries he did not fully share with me, returning to Baker Street only after luncheon with an expression that told me, before he had spoken a word, that his suspicions of the previous evening had found fertile ground. "Dr. Aldous Finch," said he, settling into his chair with the particular economy of movement that told me he had walked a considerable distance and did not care to admit fatigue, "took his medical degree at Edinburgh some 30 years ago, Watson, and, this is the detail that most rewards our attention, spent 2 years thereafter as physician to a trading concern upon the Amazon, in the province of Para, before returning to England to establish his practice. 2 years, Watson, among precisely the peoples from whose hunting arrows such alkaloids as killed Julian Ashworth are traditionally drawn, and among whom a physician of scientific curiosity, cataloguing local remedies and poisons alike for his own instruction, would have had every opportunity to acquire both specimens and the knowledge of their refinement. Good heavens, there is more. I called this morning, under pretext of a minor ailment of my own invention, upon a club in St. James's, where I am reliably informed Dr. Finch is a frequent and not always fortunate player at cards, and I learned there, from a steward whose discretion I purchased with rather less difficulty than his employer would wish, that the good doctor's debts of honour have this past year grown to a sum that I should estimate, upon the steward's rough accounting, at not less than £2,000, a sum, Watson, that a physician of modest and respectable practice, however long established, could not hope to discharge from his ordinary income within a decade, let alone the weeks the steward's manner suggested were now being pressed upon him. Then Finch had every bit as pressing a motive as Sedgwick, perhaps a more pressing one, Watson, for a solicitor's embezzlement may often be concealed a good while longer than a gambler's unpaid debt of honour, which carries with it a social ruin more immediate and more absolute than financial disgrace alone. I believe, though I have not yet proved it, that Sedgwick and Finch have been confederates in this matter for some considerable time. That Finch, aware through his long intimacy with the Carrow family of Sedgwick's management of the Ashworth estate, approached him, or was approached by him, with a proposal each found himself, in his separate desperation, unable to refuse. Sedgwick required a scientific hand to accomplish what forged documents alone could not: the permanent silencing of a young man who threatened, through his belated inquiries after old correspondence, to expose the fraud before the marriage settlement could be finalized, and the diverted funds placed beyond easy recovery. Finch required money, and no small quantity of it, and found in Sedgwick's desperate scheme both the means of payment and, I suspect, a certain contempt for a young man who had, by whatever slight or imagined slight, earned no particular affection from either conspirator. And the torn fragment, the second payment by Michaelmas, or I cannot answer for what he may. I believe now that it was written by Finch to Sedgwick, Watson, a threat that unless the second portion of his payment were made good by the quarter-day, Finch could not answer for what he, meaning, I think Finch himself, might do, whether confess the whole scheme to save himself, or take some more desperate action against Sedgwick directly. It is the letter of a confederate grown impatient and afraid, Watson, which tells us two things of the first importance: that the conspiracy remains, even now, an uneasy and mistrustful alliance rather than a settled partnership, and that Sedgwick, whatever his crimes, may yet be persuaded, properly approached, to purchase his own safety with his confederate's exposure. I sat forward. You mean to turn one against the other? I mean, Watson, to end this business before it claims a third life. For I do not believe Evelyn Carrow's silence, however medically explicable, will protect her indefinitely, and I do not intend that this household should suffer the fate of poor young Price, merely because the law moves more cautiously than a frightened murderer's desperation. I have this afternoon sent word to Gregson, requesting that a discreet watch be kept upon both Sedgwick's chambers and Finch's consulting rooms, and I have another errand of my own to perform before nightfall, one that concerns, Watson, a certain florist's establishment in Kensington High Street, from which the wedding orchids were originally supplied, and whose books, I have reason to believe, will tell us a good deal about who, precisely, had access to those flowers between the hour of their delivery and the hour of the ceremony. Chapter C. The Florist's Book. The establishment of Mr. Aloysius Bream, florist, of Kensington High Street, proved a narrow, fragrant shop crowded with hothouse blooms, presided over by a proprietor whose evident pride in his trade made him, once assured that no complaint attached to his flowers themselves, a most willing witness. The Ashworth wedding, sir? Aye, I remember it well, and sorrier work I never did in 30 years of trade, to think my own orchids played some part in it, though how a flower can be made to kill a man is beyond my understanding entirely. The vase was delivered at 8:30, I am told, said Holmes, by your own boy. Tell me, Mr. Bream, in what condition did it leave your shop, the blooms already wired for the buttonhole, or loose, to be arranged upon arrival? Wired, sir, every one, by my own hand the evening before, being 9 blooms in all for the groom's party, the groom himself, his best man, the bride's father, and 6 ushers besides, with 2 spare against breakage in the carrying. 9, and yet only 7 remained in the vase when we examined it, the groom's own having been removed for wearing, and, I am told by Inspector Gregson's inventory, 1 further bloom unaccounted for, neither pinned to any guest nor remaining in the vase. Bream's brow furrowed. That would trouble me indeed, sir, if true, for I counted 9 into that vase myself, and watched my boy carry it to his cart. Might the vase have stood unattended at the church, between its delivery and the ceremony, such that a bloom could have been removed, or exchanged for another, without your boy's knowledge? It might, sir. My boy delivers to the vestry table and returns directly for his other rounds, the wedding being but one of several calls that morning. He would not have stood guard over it. Holmes thanked the florist and, once we had regained the street, turned to me with an expression of controlled excitement. You perceive the significance, Watson. 9 blooms delivered, wired and prepared by an honest tradesman's own hand the evening before, in a manner that could not have concealed a poisoned pin without his own detection, for he assures me he examined each stem himself for the wiring's security, a habit of long practice, and would surely have felt so unusual an insertion as a silver pin driven through the stem. The substitution, therefore, or the tampering, took place after delivery, in the vestry itself. In that interval, perhaps no more than 20 minutes, perhaps a good deal longer, during which the vase stood upon the table unwatched, before the groom's party began to arrive and claim their buttonholes. Which returns us to the question of who had access to that vestry in those unwatched minutes. Precisely, Watson, and I think we may now answer it with rather more confidence than before. Voss, by his own account, was about the church upon errands during that very interval. The maid who was to pin the buttonholes had not yet arrived, by the florist boy's testimony, when the vase was delivered. The verger and his unfortunate assistant Price had free and unremarkable access to every corner of that building. And Dr. Finch, Watson, do you recall that Mrs. Prynne mentioned, when first we called upon the Carrow household, that the family physician had attended at the church that morning, ostensibly to be at hand, should the excitement of the day prove too much for either bride or elderly relation? I confessed I had not fully registered the detail amid the day's other revelations, but Holmes had plainly carried it with him since, turning it over as a jeweller turns a stone to catch each new facet of light. A physician in attendance at a wedding arouses not the smallest suspicion, Watson, and would be admitted to the vestry, before the ceremony, with perfect freedom, upon the entirely plausible pretext of ensuring the bridegroom's composure or examining some trifling complaint of nerves. I begin to believe, Watson, that we have found not merely the hand that supplied the poison, but the very hand that placed it, and that Sedgwick's role, whatever his complicity in the scheme's design and its financial motive, may have been confined chiefly to the forged documents and the diversion of funds that scheme was meant to secure, while the vestry itself, and the boy Price's silencing besides, were the work of a man far better placed than any solicitor to move unremarked among the sick, the nervous, and the dying. Then we go now to confront Finch? Not yet, Watson. A man of Finch's evident intelligence, confronted directly upon suspicion alone, will simply deny all, destroy what evidence remains within his reach, and leave us no stronger than before, save that our quarry will thereafter be forewarned and doubly cautious. No, I think the time has come, at last, to set the trap I spoke of, and I think, Watson, that Evelyn Carrow herself, silent still though she may be, holds the one piece of bait to which a guilty conscience cannot fail to rise. Chapter 14. Holmes's Design. That evening, in the privacy of our sitting-room, Holmes laid out to Gregson, to Dr. Watson, myself, that is, for I confess I felt the full weight of my own role in what followed, and, by special and closely guarded arrangement, to Mr. Ambrose Carrow himself, the plan by which he proposed to draw the truth into the light. "We shall let it be known," said Holmes, "through channels that will reach Dr. Finch's ears within a day at most. A word to a servant here, a paragraph placed with discretion in an evening paper's account of the case there, that Miss Carrow's voice has begun to return, that her physician," here his lip curled very slightly, "reports marked improvement, and that she has indicated her intention to speak fully to the police upon the morning following, once she has rested sufficiently to bear the ordeal of an interview. We shall further let it be understood that she will be quite alone in her chamber that night, her aunt having been persuaded, upon a pretext I shall arrange, to sleep elsewhere in the house, and the usual servants dismissed early to their own quarters, leaving, to any person familiar with the household's arrangements, an opportunity that a desperate and guilty man, believing his exposure imminent, would find very difficult to resist." Mr. Carrow, upon hearing this scheme, went pale as chalk. "You would use my daughter as bait for a murderer, Mr. Holmes? After all she has already suffered. I would use her, sir, with every precaution I know how to arrange, to end the danger that hangs over her permanently, rather than allow her to remain, night after night, exposed to a threat that will not diminish, while its author remains free and aware that her voice may, at any hour, return in full. I do not propose that she be truly alone. I propose rather that it appear so to any person watching the house from without, while in truth her chamber shall be guarded as closely as any chamber in London. Inspector Gregson himself, with 2 of his most trusted constables, concealed within the dressing-room adjoining, myself and Dr. Watson within the chamber itself, positioned where we cannot be seen from the door, and Miss Carrow's own bed occupied, not by the lady herself, who shall be removed in perfect secrecy to her aunt's true refuge this very afternoon, but by a bolster and pillows arranged beneath the coverlet, in a manner that will deceive, in the dim light of a single shaded candle, any eye but the closest scrutiny. Gregson, who had listened to this scheme with a policeman's natural caution, nodded slowly. "It is bold, Mr. Holmes, and I own I like it better than waiting upon events, as we have been forced to do since poor Price's death. But if Finch does not come, if he is more cautious than you suppose, or if some other hand entirely proves responsible, then we shall have lost nothing but a night's sleep, Inspector, and shall be no worse placed than we are this evening. But I do not think he will fail to come. Consider his position. He believes, for I intend that he shall believe it most thoroughly, that within a day, perhaps two, the one witness capable of naming him will regain her voice entirely and speak to the police. He cannot silence a woman guarded, as she has been these 3 days past, by a constable at her door, and a household roused to vigilance by 2 murders already committed beneath their notice. But a woman alone, in the small hours, her guard relaxed by the general belief that the household sleeps, and the danger, in the public understanding at least, still points chiefly towards Sedgwick and the unfortunate Miss Rain. That, gentlemen, is an opportunity I do not believe a desperate man in Finch's position, with £2,000 of debt pressing upon him and the gallows now added to his fears, will find himself able to forego. And if he brings the poison again, I said, with some anxiety I did not trouble to disguise, administered by some means we have not anticipated. I have thought of that, Watson, and it is precisely why I insist upon your presence rather than Gregson's constables alone. For no man in London is better placed than yourself to recognise the first sign of such an attempt and to counter it, and no man's steady hand I would trust more readily in the darkness of that room, should our quarry prove more dangerous at the moment of discovery than a solicitor's forged signatures have hitherto suggested he might be. It was arranged in the end precisely as Holmes proposed, though not without further protest from the anxious father, mollified only by Holmes's solemn assurance, an assurance I privately hoped he would prove able to keep, that his daughter's true safety was never, at any point in the scheme, to be placed in the smallest jeopardy. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Evelyn Carrow, veiled and silent as she had been since her wedding morning, was conveyed by a closed carriage to an address known only to Holmes, Gregson, and her own father, while in Phillimore Gardens the household began, with careful and deliberate indiscretion, to let it be known among servants and callers alike that the young lady's recovery progressed apace, and that tomorrow, God willing, she would at last be able to tell her story. Chapter 15. The Trap at Midnight. The hours of waiting that followed were, I think, among the longest I have passed in all my years at Holmes's side. We took our places in Evelyn Carrow's darkened chamber a little before 9 o'clock, Holmes and I concealed behind the heavy folds of a window curtain that gave us a clear view of both door and bed, while in the small dressing-room beyond, Gregson and his 2 constables waited in a silence broken only, very occasionally, by the faint creak of a shifted boot upon the floorboard. The bolster arranged beneath the coverlet made, in the dim light of the single candle left burning upon the night-table, a convincing enough impression of a sleeping form, and I found myself, despite the tension of the vigil, admiring the care with which Holmes had arranged every detail, the angle of the pillow suggesting a head turned toward the wall, a fold of dark hair, cut that afternoon from Mrs. Prynne's own maid with the good woman's willing consent, spread artfully upon the linen. 10 o'clock passed, and 11, marked by the distant chime of a church clock that I could not help but reflect, with a shudder, was very likely that of St. Mary Abbots itself, tolling the hour over a churchyard that had already claimed one victim of this affair. Holmes beside me remained utterly motionless, his eyes fixed upon the window which had been left, at his particular instruction, unlatched, a detail that struck me, upon reflection, as a deliberate echo of the vestry window through which, we now believed, young Price had met his death, and which I understood Holmes intended as a lure fully as pointed as the rumour of Evelyn's returning voice, offering Finch the very avenue of silent, unobserved entry that his previous crimes suggested he would instinctively prefer to a door that might creak or be watched. or require some more visible pretext for admission. It was a little past midnight when I first heard it, a faint scraping sound from without, so slight that I might, in any lesser state of vigilance, have mistaken it for the settling of the old house's timbers, or the wind stirring an ivy branch against the sill. Holmes's hand closed upon my arm in the darkness, a silent signal, and I felt every muscle in my own frame draw taut. The window, already unlatched, moved by degrees, so slowly that the change was perceptible only by comparing, moment to moment, the width of the gap through which the cold night air now entered. A gloved hand appeared upon the sill, then a second, and then, with the careful practised silence of a man who had performed such an entry before, a figure drew itself over the sill and into the room, a figure whose outline, even in the near darkness, I recognized at once by its stooped grey-whiskered precision as that of Dr. Aldous Finch. He stood a moment, motionless, evidently listening for any sound that might betray a household roused, and hearing nothing, moved with soft, deliberate steps toward the bed, drawing from within his coat, as he came, a small case which he opened without a sound, revealing, even at that distance, the glint of a slender instrument not unlike the pin that had ended Julian Ashworth's life. He bent over the false form beneath the coverlet, and in that instant, as his hand rose with its terrible small weapon poised above the pillow where a sleeping woman's throat should have lain, Holmes stepped from behind the curtain into the candlelight. "I should not trouble yourself further, Dr. Finch," said he, in a voice that carried, in its very quietness, a force I had rarely heard him command. "Miss Carrow is not here, and has not been here these 8 hours past. It is, I am afraid, only your own guilt that has kept this appointment." Finch spun about with a cry that was half gasp, half snarl, and for one dreadful instant I believed he meant to fling himself at Holmes with the very pin still clutched in his hand. But in that same instant the dressing-room door burst open, and Gregson, with his constables close behind, was upon him before he could take a single step, wresting the little case from his grasp, with a force that sent it clattering to the floor, its silver instrument skittering harmlessly across the boards. "Aldous Finch," said Gregson, breathing hard but steady of voice, "I arrest you for the murder of Julian Ashworth, and of Thomas Price besides, and I caution you that anything you say—" "I say nothing," Finch broke in, his composure returning with a swiftness that chilled me more than his violence had, "save that you will find, Inspector, upon any fair examination, no shred of evidence beyond an old man's foolish visit to a supposedly sleeping patient's window, which any physician, anxious for a recovering charge, might, in his concern for her welfare." "Come, Doctor," said Holmes, and there was in his voice now something almost of weariness, as though the final unmasking of a clever and desperate man brought him less satisfaction than sorrow for the waste of 2 lives and the corruption of a trust so many had placed, for so many years, in this respectable and murderous physician. "You forget that Mr. Sedgwick, your confederate in this enterprise, has been under discreet observation these 2 days past, and that a man threatened, as your own hand threatened him in writing, with consequences he could not answer for, is not, in my long experience, a man who holds his tongue for very long, once he perceives that his partner has been taken, and his own freedom hangs upon nothing more than a solicitor's habitual discretion. I think, Doctor, you will find that the case against you no longer rests upon this night's foolishness alone." Chapter 16. Sedgwick's Confession. Holmes's assertion, though made with all the confident authority he could command, was not, at the moment he uttered it, entirely a certainty. Sedgwick had been watched, but not yet approached, and I confess my own heart misgave me, in the hour that followed Finch's removal to the cells, that the solicitor might yet prove more loyal to his confederate, or more skilled in his own denials, than Holmes's bold assertion had assumed. We had not long to wait, however, before events proved Holmes's judgment of character, as so often, entirely sound. Word reached Gregson before dawn that Percival Sedgwick, informed by a constable stationed near his chambers, with rather more theatrical emphasis upon Finch's arrest than strict duty required, at Holmes's own private suggestion, that his confederate had been taken in the very act of attempted murder, had sent at once for the police himself, declaring his intention to make a full statement before the law could shape one for him. We found him, when we arrived at Scotland Yard that morning, a broken and diminished figure, his solicitor's composure entirely stripped away, seated across a bare table from Gregson, with the haunted look of a man who has carried a secret so long that its release, however ruinous, comes almost as a relief. "I did not kill him, Mr. Holmes," were his first words, before even a question had been put to him. "I want that understood above all else. I forged the settlement, God forgive me. I diverted funds from the estate that were never mine to touch. I did every dishonest thing a desperate man does when he sees ruin approaching and believes, in his folly, that one more deception will buy him time enough to set all right again before anyone the wiser. But I did not kill Julian. I did not know, until the very morning of the wedding, that Finch intended murder at all. You believed, until that morning, that some lesser scheme was afoot," Holmes said, not a question, but a statement offered to draw the fuller truth. "I believed we meant only to delay the settlement's final examination. Finch had spoken, weeks before, of some tincture that might produce a convincing illness, sufficient to postpone the wedding and the accompanying scrutiny of the estate's accounts, until I had contrived to conceal the worst of the shortfall. I am a coward, Mr. Holmes, and a thief, but I had persuaded myself, in my desperation, that no one need be seriously harmed. It was only that morning, in the vestry, when Finch pressed the poisoned orchid into my own hand, and instructed me, in a whisper, to see that Julian pinned it to his coat before the ceremony, while he himself withdrew to establish an alibi among the gathering guests, that I understood the tincture I had imagined was in truth a poison meant to kill. And by then, Mr. Holmes, by then it was already done, for I had not the courage, God help me, to refuse him, nor the courage after to confess what I had done." "And the note that summoned Miss Carrow to the vestry?" Sedgwick's head sank lower. "That was Finch's device entirely, not mine. He feared, I think, that Julian, waiting alone, might grow suspicious of the orchid's unfamiliar weight, or feel some premonitory unease that would lead him to set it aside unworn. He believed that Evelyn's presence, her hand perhaps helping to pin the flower, as brides are fond of doing for their grooms upon such mornings, would ensure the boutonniere was worn exactly as intended, and worn quickly, before any doubt could arise. He did not anticipate, I think, that she would arrive early enough to witness Julian's collapse, nor that her own touch upon his stricken form would draw her, however briefly, into the poison's effect as well. When I saw her kneeling there beside him, silent and stricken, I believed for one dreadful moment that she too was dying, and I confess, Mr. Holmes, that in that moment I very nearly gave myself up entirely, out of horror at what our scheme had wrought. But Finch, arriving moments later among the general confusion, drew me aside and warned me that any word from me now would hang us both, and I was coward enough, still, to hold my tongue. "The button," said Holmes. "Charlotte Rain's glove button. Was that your device, or Finch's?" "Finch's, planted weeks before this affair reached its crisis, against just such a need as arose. He had taken the glove from Miss Rain's own house some months past, during a professional call upon her mother, and kept it by him, he told me once with a coldness that chilled my blood even then, against a day when a scapegoat might prove convenient. I did not know, until this very affair unfolded, how carefully and how far in advance that man had planned for every contingency." "And young Price?" Here Sedgwick's composure broke entirely, and it was some minutes before he could continue. "That I learned of only after it was done, Mr. Holmes, and it was that, more than any other single thing, that convinced me our alliance had become a thing I could no longer endure, whatever the cost to myself of confessing it. Finch told me, with no more emotion than a man reporting a matter of business concluded, that the boy had approached him seeking money for his silence, and that he had met him at the church late in the evening, on pretence of discussing the matter, and had, his own words, Mr. Holmes, attended to it. I have not slept an untroubled night since." Holmes rose from his chair, and I saw upon his face an expression I had come, over years of acquaintance, to recognize as his particular reserve for those criminals whose guilt, though real, seemed to him tempered by a weakness more pitiable than monstrous. "You will hang, Mr. Sedgwick, or very near it, for your part in this. The law makes little distinction, in the end, between the hand that strikes and the hand that arranges the striking. But I think, for what small comfort it may afford you, that your confession this morning has done more to secure a measure of justice, for Julian Ashworth, for young Price, and above all for Evelyn Carrow, whose recovery may now proceed without the shadow of unproven suspicion hanging over her, than any denial could have accomplished, however skillfully maintained." Chapter 10. The Chain of Deception. It was 3 days later, in the more comfortable surroundings of our own sitting room at Baker Street, that Holmes consented at last to lay out for Gregson, for myself, and, at her own earnest and now fully spoken request, for Evelyn Carrow herself, the complete chain of reasoning by which the truth had been unwound from its tangle of forged signatures, poisoned flowers, and false trails. Evelyn had come to us that afternoon on her father's arm, pale still, and quiet by nature though no longer by affliction. Her voice, when she used it, carrying a fragile huskiness that Doctor, a new physician, Mrs. Prynne's own trusted family friend, having necessarily replaced Finch, assured us would pass entirely within a month or two. "I have wanted, Mr. Holmes, more than I can say to thank you," she began, "and to tell you, now that I am able, what I saw that morning, though I understand from Inspector Gregson that you had very largely reasoned it out already. I had reasoned out the shape of it, Miss Carrow, but I confess I should value very much hearing the truth from your own lips, if you feel equal to the telling." She folded her hands, in a gesture I remembered from her silent stillness in that chamber of shock, and spoke slowly, as though each word were still, in some sense, a labour. "I received the note that morning, and went to the vestry as it asked, believing I should learn some secret of Julian's past, that I ought, in fairness to myself, to know before I bound my life to his. I found him already collapsed upon the floor, Mr. Holmes, and I ran to him, and took him in my arms, and he was still living, for a moment, though I could see even then that some terrible thing had overtaken him. He tried to speak. I could not understand more than a fragment, a single word, over and over, that I took at the time for delirium, and have only these past days come to understand as a name he was trying, with his last strength, to give me." Her voice caught, and her father's hand tightened upon her own. He said, Mr. Holmes, again and again, as clearly as his failing breath permitted, "Finch." I did not understand it. I did not want to understand it, for Dr. Finch had attended our family since my childhood, and the thought that I could not accept it, Mr. Holmes, even as the poison that had touched my own glove began to still my own throat, even as I knelt there unable to call for help, unable to do anything but hold Julian as he died, and watch the very man he had named come through that door moments later, with a face full of such practised concern that I doubted, in my confusion and my growing paralysis, the evidence of what I had just heard. "And so your silence," said Holmes gently, "was born not only of the poison's physical effect, but of a mind unable to reconcile what it had heard with what it believed it knew, and, I do not doubt, a very natural terror of what might befall you should you name, wrongly or rightly, a man of such standing, while you yourself lay helpless and unable to defend the accusation." "I feared, too," she admitted, very low, "that I had misheard him entirely, that grief and shock had supplied a name where none was truly spoken, and that I might send an innocent man to the gallows through some cruel trick of a dying moment's confusion. It was easier, Mr. Holmes, God forgive my weakness, to say nothing at all than to risk being wrong about so terrible a thing." Holmes nodded slowly. "It was no weakness, Miss Carrow, but a very natural and very human caution, and I think it no small credit to your own judgment that you offered us, when at last you found the means, not a direct accusation, but a fragment of true evidence, the button, that led us, by our own reasoning, toward a truth you dared not speak outright, until you could be certain of it. Now, gentlemen, he turned to Gregson and to me, settling back into his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man about to review a solved problem in its entirety. Let me set the whole chain before you, from its first link to its last. Percival Sedgwick, embarrassed in his finances through unwise speculation, began some years since to divert funds from the Ashworth estate under his management, concealing the shortfall through a series of increasingly desperate forgeries. Julian Ashworth, indifferent to business by temperament, noticed nothing until his approaching marriage, an event that must, by ordinary custom, bring his affairs under closer examination than they had lately received, prompted him to make certain inquiries, including his curious letter to Miss Rain concerning old correspondence that may, we shall likely never know for certain, have contained some early hint of irregularity that Julian half remembered and wished to verify before it was too late. Sedgwick, sensing exposure approaching, turned in his desperation to Dr. Aldous Finch, a man he had known through the Carrow and Rain families for years, and a man whose own crushing debts of honour, incurred at the card table, made him, Sedgwick perhaps reasoned, a confederate whose silence could be purchased, and whose scientific training, acquired during his years upon the Amazon, offered a means of delay, or so Sedgwick was led to believe, that required no violence at all. Finch, however, saw in the scheme not a means of delay but a permanent solution to both men's difficulties. A solution he had, I believe, contemplated and prepared for weeks in advance, as the button taken long since from Miss Rain's glove-box attests. He refined, from specimens gathered during his years abroad, a purified curare alkaloid, concealed it upon a pin inserted into Julian's own wedding boutonniere, and ensured, through the anonymous note that drew Miss Carrow to the vestry, that the flower would be worn quickly and without suspicion. When young Price, some days later, proved careless enough to hint at knowledge he did not fully understand, and foolish enough to seek payment for his silence, Finch murdered him as calmly as he had murdered Julian, and would, I have no doubt whatever, have murdered Evelyn Carrow herself, in her own bed, 3 nights past, had the trap we set not drawn him instead into Inspector Gregson's waiting hands. Chapter Det 80. Aftermath at Baker Street. The trial of Aldous Finch and Percival Sedgwick, when at length it came before the assizes some weeks later, occupied the public imagination for the better part of a fortnight, and I shall not weary the reader with a full account of proceedings that added little to what Holmes had already established with such precision in our own sitting-room. Finch, true to the cold composure I had observed even at the moment of his capture, maintained his innocence to the last, and it was only the combined weight of Sedgwick's confession, Stamford's chemical analysis, and the quiet, devastating testimony of Evelyn Carrow herself, delivered, by then, in a voice grown nearly as strong as it had been before that terrible wedding morning, that secured his conviction. He was hanged at Newgate in the last week of November, protesting, even upon the scaffold, some final and unconvincing claim of scientific persecution that satisfied, I believe, no one who had followed the case's evidence. Sedgwick, whose confession and evident remorse weighed somewhat in his favour, was spared the gallows but sentenced to penal servitude for the remainder of his natural life, a sentence he received, by every account, with a broken man's resignation rather than any protest of the mercy shown him. Charlotte Rain, wholly cleared of any suspicion, called upon us at Baker Street some days after the trial's conclusion to express a gratitude she confessed she had not expected to feel toward the detective whose questions had, at first, seemed to threaten her with ruin. "I own I misjudged you, Mr. Holmes," said she, with the same directness that had marked our first meeting, "believing you had come to accuse rather than to acquit. I am grateful to have been wrong." "You were neither wrong nor foolish to fear it, Miss Rain," Holmes replied. "A stranger arriving with pointed questions in the aftermath of a murder gives every reasonable person cause for alarm, and I think your candour with us, even at the risk of appearing to protest too readily, did you more credit in the end than any silence would have done." Evelyn Carrow, for her part, did not remain in London through the winter. but withdrew with her father to a married aunt's household in Devonshire, where I am glad to report, from a letter Holmes received some months later, that her voice had returned entirely, and her spirits, though marked forever, I do not doubt, by the horror of that wedding morning, had begun at last to mend. Her father's own financial difficulties, so cruelly exploited by the two conspirators, found some relief through a modest settlement arranged, at Holmes's private suggestion and Julian Ashworth's own family's evident sense of obligation. From what remained of the estate, once Sedgwick's defalcations had been traced, and, so far as was possible, recovered. Reginald Voss called upon us once more, some weeks after the trial, no longer the stricken young man who had first climbed our stair, but still visibly marked by the loss of the friend he had known since boyhood. "I wonder, Mr. Holmes," said he, as he prepared to take his leave, "whether I might have prevented it, had I stayed by Julian's side that morning, instead of attending to my errands. You could not have known, Mr. Voss, that a trusted physician of 15 years' standing harboured murder in his medical bag, and I think it a very dangerous habit of mind to burden oneself with guilt for failing to prevent a crime whose very design depended upon deceiving everyone who trusted its author. Julian Ashworth was murdered by a man skilled beyond the ordinary in the art of appearing harmless, and it is that skill, not any failure of friendship on your part, that bears the whole weight of blame." Voss seemed at these words to stand a little straighter as he departed, and I confess I watched him go with the particular satisfaction I had learned, over years at Holmes's side, to take in the small mercies our investigations were sometimes able to offer, even amid the wreckage of tragedies that no unravelling of truth could ever fully undo. Chapter 19. A Philosophical Postscript. It was a bleak December evening, some weeks after the last formalities of the case had been concluded, when I found occasion to raise with Holmes a question that had lingered in my mind since the trial's end. A question, I think, that the whole strange business of the Silent Bride had planted there more firmly than any case we had undertaken in some years. "Do you never tire, Holmes?" I asked, as we sat before a fire built high against the season's first true cold, of discovering, again and again, how thoroughly a respectable face may conceal a monstrous heart. I confess this case has left me with less faith in appearances than I possessed before it began. Holmes considered the question for some while, his pipe glowing in the gathering dusk, before he answered, "I do not think it a matter of faith lost, Watson, so much as a faith more properly placed. You are troubled that Dr. Finch, churchwarden and family physician of 15 years' unblemished repute, proved capable of murder twice over, and would have proved it a third time but for our intervention. I am troubled by no such thing, for I never place my faith in reputation, Watson, only in evidence, and it is precisely because most men, most of the time, are exactly what they appear to be, that the rare exception proves so dangerous and so difficult to detect until one has trained oneself never to mistake the general rule for a guarantee in any particular case. That is a cold philosophy, Holmes. It is a useful one, which I have found, upon the whole, a good deal more comforting than the alternative. For consider, Watson, that it was not reputation that saved Evelyn Carrow's life in the end, nor any general faith in the goodness of physicians or the honesty of solicitors, but the patient, unglamorous work of examining a single pin, a single glove, a single torn scrap of paper found beneath a table leg, each of which told its own small, stubborn truth regardless of what any person standing in society might have led an incautious observer to assume. I take considerable comfort, Watson, in the knowledge that the truth, however carefully concealed, leaves always some mark upon the world that a sufficiently patient eye may discover, a comfort I should not enjoy nearly so much were I inclined, as most men are inclined, to let a man's reputation stand as security for his innocence. I turned this over in my mind a while, watching the fire settle and shift within the grate. And Sedgwick, do you think him wholly damned, Holmes, or is there something in his confession, his evident remorse, that argues some remaining measure of the good in him. I think, Watson, that Sedgwick was a weak man rather than a wicked one at heart, drawn step by step into a horror he had not the courage either to fully embrace or to refuse, until refusal came, at last, too late to save either Julian Ashworth or young Price, though not, I am glad to say, too late to save Evelyn Carrow, nor too late to spare himself the rope, however little that mercy may weigh against what he permitted to be done. It is a distinction the law is not always well equipped to draw, Watson, between the man who plans a murder and the man who merely fails, through cowardice, to prevent one he did not desire. But it is a distinction, I think, worth drawing nonetheless, if only for our own understanding of how such tragedies come, by such small and human steps, to pass. He rose then, and crossed to the window, where the lamplight of Baker Street glimmered faintly through a curtain of falling snow, the first of the season, settling soft and silent upon a city that knew nothing, and would likely never know in any detail, of the quiet horror that had visited a Kensington church some weeks before. "There will be another case before long, Watson," said he, without turning from the window, in the tone of a man already looking past the satisfactions of a problem solved toward whatever fresh puzzle the great restless city might yet produce. "There always is. But I confess I shall not soon forget the particular cruelty of this one. A bride struck silent upon her wedding day, forced to carry, in a throat the poison itself had stilled, the one truth that might have named her husband's murderer, until patience and a little chemistry restored to her the voice that terror alone could never have given back. I said nothing, but reached for my own pipe, and we sat together a while longer in the comfortable silence of old friends, as the snow gathered upon the sill and the fire burned low, and somewhere beyond our window London went on, indifferent and unceasing, toward whatever new mystery the coming winter held in store. The end.